swapped out, you know. So we get the rest of them coming in now. We get some coming in, and the ones that's been being here, they ain't here. So anyway, but that's all right. Anyway, we finished up last week with the 5th chapter of the book of Matthew, and the first chapter in the Sermon on the Mount. And so this week we will begin in the 6th chapter, and we'll see what the Lord has to say to us. And so we're going to begin reading in the first verse of the 6th chapter, and we're just going to read down through verse 15 because there's a lot of verses, so I don't want to read the whole thing. So we'll just read verses 1 through 15. So if you will, read along with me, and then we'll get into the lesson. Matthew 6:1, it says, "Take heed that ye do not your alms before men to be seen of them. Otherwise ye have no reward of your Father which is in heaven. Therefore when thou doest thine alms, do not sound a trumpet before thee, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory of men. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. But when thou doest alms, let not thy left hand know what thy right hand doeth, that thine alms may be in secret, and thy Father which is seeth thee in secret himself shall reward thee openly. And when thou prayest, thou shalt not be as the hypocrites are, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and in the corners of the streets, that they may be seen of men. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. But thou, when thou prayest, enter into thy closet, and when thou hast shut thy door, pray to the Father which is in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret shall reward thee openly. But when ye pray, use not vain repetitions as the heathen do, for they think that they shall be heard for their much speaking. Be not ye therefore like unto them, for your Father knoweth what things ye have need of before ye ask him. After this manner, therefore pray ye, Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. For if you forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you forgive not men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. And so we continue on. In the last half of the previous chapter, we talked about the intent of the heart. We began, like I said last week, as we recap, we began with the attitudes or the Beatitudes, the attitude of the Beatitudes, and then we wound up on the last part of the chapter, last half, dealt with the intent of the heart. What was your intent, or what was the purpose of the heart? And so we talked about the intent of the heart, or the mind as we understand it. What was in your heart versus manifested itself outwardly. Basically in the first chapter, or the latter part of the first chapter, it was about what was in your heart that manifested itself. In other words, corrupt thoughts produce corrupt actions. And so that's essentially what it was. Corrupt thoughts producing corrupt actions. And so now in this chapter, Jesus begins to talk about what we do outwardly versus what is in our heart. And in other words, what we do on the outside does not line up with the inside, with the outside. What's on the inside doesn't line up with the outside, or vice versa. Like I said, in the previous chapter, corrupt thoughts always produce corrupt actions. But here we have righteous acts which did not line up here with what the intent of the heart was. There was something different. So in this chapter, Jesus begins to talk about what we do outwardly versus what is in the heart. In other words, what we do on the outside does not line up with what is on the inside. And so we can do good things on the outside with a completely different motive and intent of the heart. In other words, what we may do may appear righteous to someone. It may seem like a good deed, and it may indeed be a good deed, but it's not the motivation of your heart. But anyway, we'll talk about it as we get further into the lesson. Jesus in the previous chapter began to lay the foundation against the corrupt doctrines of the scribes and the Pharisees and the other traditional teachers of that time. And he begins to warn the people here against their actual corrupt practices. He began in the previous chapter with the corrupt thoughts, dealing with the mind, and now he's going to begin to deal with the outward actions. And so he begins to warn the people here against the scribes and the Pharisees and their corrupt practices, doing things outwardly only to appear righteous unto men. So there are two things that Jesus warns about, or he talks about in particular in this chapter, which we'll cover as we get through it, is hypocrisy and being worldly minded. Hypocrisy and I'll say that word in a minute, hypocrisy and worldly minded. Each of these identifies someone who has two different minds about something. So if you think about it, hypocrisy, Don't let me get ahead of myself. I'll be trying to teach something I need to wait on, so I'm going to try to lay this down. But it identifies somebody who has two different minds about something. You think about that hypocrisy and worldly minded. If you don't know what hypocrisy is, we're going to learn this morning. And so the hypocrite is someone who says one thing and does another, often with a specific motive. The worldly minded is a believer who continually is worries about, or is continually hindered or worried about, worried or has a desire for the things of the world or the need of the things. In other words, he's hindered because, being worldly minded, either he's desiring the things of the world, worried about obtaining the things of the world, or either he's worried about having what he needs, his needs being met. And so he's double-minded in that way. So James, he wrote about the double-minded. And although he was talking about faith, I believe we can apply his logical thinking to what is being spoken here. So we look in James 1, 6, and 8. What did James write about the double-minded? And so I'm going to bring this into it in just a moment. He said in James 1, 6, and 8, he said, "But let him ask in faith, not wavering, for he that wavereth is like a wave of the sea." Let me read that again. "For he that wavereth is like a wave of the sea, driven with the wind and tossed. For let not that man think that he shall receive anything of the Lord. A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways." And of course, we know what he was talking about. He was talking about faith, not wavering in your faith. And we understand the analogy of a wave on the sea. We've all been to the Gulf of Mexico. Some of you have perhaps been out on the sea. The waves will be going this way one minute, they'll be going this way the next minute, and this way the next minute. And so they're constantly vacillating from one place to another. And so how could we, or how might we apply James' thought to the hypocrite and the worldly minded? When we talk about being double-minded, how can we apply James' thought to the hypocrite and the worldly minded? Because the double-minded man is never settled on one thing, and neither is the hypocrite or the worldly minded. So you think about it like this. The motivations and the intent of the hypocrite is always different than their actions. The motive and the intent of the hypocrite is always different than their actions. So a hypocrite, what is a hypocrite? We basically give you a summarization of it, what it was. It is someone who says one thing and does another. They say one thing, but they do another. So we can all say we know who hypocrites are, and I'm sure we can say we know some hypocrites. And perhaps maybe we have even been called a hypocrite. And so that's not a good thing if we're being called a hypocrite. So it should cause us to examine ourselves. But nonetheless, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are just because somebody says you are. Most of the world says most Christians are hypocrites anyway. So that don't really matter to us in that extent. But anyway, so the worldly-minded are those who love God and want to serve Him, but they are driven by desire or worries for the things of the world. And so, in other words, they can't get their mind focused on God and the things of God, because they're always pursuing the things of the world. In other words, they're constantly worried about their job, worrying about obtaining that new home. And listen, don't misunderstand, nothing wrong with having those things. But when your mind becomes consumed with those things and you're constantly being driven, that it draws your mind away from God, that you are pursuing those things more than you are God, then you're being double-minded in your minds. You see what I'm saying? And on the other side of it, when you constantly worry about having your needs met, well, I'm not going to have enough to pay this bill. I'm not going to have enough to put food on the table. I'm not going to have enough to do this or enough to do that. You're worried about your needs being met. And see, that's not having faith in God, because He said that He would supply all of our needs. And so the point is, you're being double-minded in that way, because you're being torn between being the mind of Christ and being not having your needs met. And so you can be double-minded in that way. So Jesus declares in verse number 24 of this chapter that no man can serve two masters. Let's just read that right quick. And it says, "No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and man." So Jesus makes it very plain as we'll get further into the lesson as time progresses, that you can't serve two masters. So you can't be double-minded. And so when we talk about the hypocrite and the worldly minded, we're talking about people who have a double mind. They have a double mind. They can't be steady on anything. And Adam Clark wrote it like this. You think about it. God is one, and He's indivisible, right? And so you can only draw one straight line to something that is indivisible, right? You can only draw one straight line to something that is indivisible. And so Jesus is essentially teaching here your intent and the motive of your heart or your mind, if you either interchangeable in this context, your intent or your motive needs to be correct, and your intent or your action need to match up with your motive and your intent. So like I said in the beginning, in the latter part of the last chapter, Jesus talked about what was in the heart, the corruption, basically the corruption in the heart. A corrupt thought brings corrupt actions. And so now Jesus is talking about a corrupt heart trying to bring forth good actions. And so you're not, even though you may be doing something good and it's not matching up with the intent of your heart, there's something amiss. And so what Jesus is saying, look, you got to match, you got to line up. Your actions have got to line up with the intent of your heart. You see what I'm saying? And so you may do all the good deeds you want to, but if your heart and your motive is not right, then, it's not going to please God. And so we'll get into that as we go. So, let me just finish with this statement, and we'll move into the next part I got here. So, heart, mind correction first will lead to the correct motives of the outward actions. Heart, mind correction first will lead to the correct motives of the outward action. This is why Jesus first dealt with the heart and mind. Get this right in here, then everything that you do coming out from there, your motives, your actions, whatever that you do will be right, because it will be lined up with what is in here. And so that's why we got to get this right in here before we can actually do righteous, true righteous deeds. And so we'll talk about that. So now, back over to where we were. Verse 1 again. It says, take heed that you do not your alms before men, to be seen of them, otherwise you have no reward of your Father which is in heaven. Now, first thing we need to do is establish what the word alms means. And so our first thought, and we've always mostly been taught that alms means money, giving of money. And that's not incorrect. That is right in one sense of the word. But the actual word means more than just giving money. So let me just give you the definition according to Vine. Alms connected with eleomen. And I know I'm not pronouncing that right. I can try it all I want to, and I still am not going to pronounce it right. But anyway, it means merciful, signify. It means mercy, pity. So see, particularly in giving alms, the benefit or benefaction itself, the alms. And so if you look, there's many different ancient copies have the word here for alms. They'll have the word righteousness in it. And in fact, a lot of older manuscripts and some of the best manuscripts didn't have the word alms, but they had the word righteousness in there. So your righteousness for alms is righteousness for alms. And so the Jews called the poor box the box of righteousness. And if you go to the newer translations, a lot of them don't use the word alms, but rather they use the word righteous. And so what I'm trying to establish something here, because I want you to understand that alms is not just about money, just putting money in somebody's pocket or money in the offering plate. It's much more than that. And so like in the NASB, it says it like this. It reads, Matthew 6:1 reads this: beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed of them, otherwise you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven. So you replace that word alms with righteousness, it brings a whole different meaning on it, or a different understanding on it, what the true intent of it was. And so while alms was indeed given to the poor, or acts of righteousness may be considered an act of righteousness, alms was not strictly limited to giving money to the poor. So righteousness could have been any deed, going helping someone out, someone that was in need. Let me just say, for instance, an elderly person that needs their grass cut or something of that nature. You go and help them. That could be considered as an act of righteousness, or what the Bible would call here, or what it says in the King James Version, alms. And so act of righteousness is what it is. And so we read in Psalms 112:9, it says this. It says, he hath dispersed, he hath given to the poor, his righteousness endureth forever. His horn shall be exalted. So righteousness was a common word for alms amongst the Jewish community. So it was basically interchangeable, if you want to put it that word. So they were one and the same, and yet, like I said, alms was not just a matter of money, but it was all acts of righteousness. So alms and righteousness would include any and all acts of righteousness, whether it be giving money or any other acts of charity. And so if you want to know what some of the acts of charity are, you can go, for instance, to 1 Corinthians, the 13th chapter, the chapter on love, where Paul talked about that. He talks about charity and those different things. But anyway, so in the first 18 verses of Matthew 6, Jesus declares 3 acts of righteousness. In the first 18 verses, he declares 3 acts of righteousness. The giving of alms, which that would be the giving of money, essentially. Prayer and fasting. The giving of alms, prayer, and fasting. Now, we don't necessarily think about prayer as an act of righteousness. We don't necessarily think about fasting as an act of righteousness. But as we get in further into the lesson, we'll see what he's speaking about here. So, in each, Jesus declared that these 3 things should be done in secret in order to be received and be blessed of Jehovah. So he said, therefore, he said, do not your alms before men to be seen of them, otherwise ye have reward. He said, therefore, when thou doest thine alms, do not sound a trumpet before thee, but, in the final place, he said, before thee, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have the glory of men. Verily I say to you, they have the reward. And so he tells them in verse number 4, thine alms may be in secret. He said, give that in secret, that the Father which seeth thee in secret shall reward thee openly. And so there's some things we'll discuss concerning that one particular verse in a few minutes as well. But anyway, so in each of these, like I said, Jesus declares that 3 things that should be done in secret that in order to be received and to be blessed of the Lord. So what does it reveal to you? Think about this for a minute. What does it reveal when you do these things in secret? When you do these things in secret, you pray in secret, you give alms, you give offering to the church or whatever that is, you give offering to money to somebody you know that's in need or whatever. What does it do when you do those things in secret? What does it reveal when you do those things in secret? Think about it, what we just talked about, just in the first part of the lesson. That your motive and intent is not self-righteousness, but it's God-righteousness. It reveals that your motive and intent is not self-righteousness, but God-righteousness. And basically you could say, you could interchange the word self-righteousness here with a hypocrite and the worldly mind, but mainly with the hypocrite if you want to put it that way, because you think about what is self-righteousness. Is that you think that you're going to be rewarded or that you're going to get into the kingdom of God by your own works of righteousness. And so therefore, if you do those works to be seen of men, you have your reward of men, but not of God. And so therefore, what you do in secret, see, is seen only of God. And so therefore, it reveals the true intent of your heart. Though man may never know it, see, but God does. And so we know and we understand that there is a time of public prayer. So it's not to say that when we pray all the time that there's not a time of public prayer, because there's nothing wrong with that. Jesus wasn't speaking against those things. But what he was speaking about, Jesus' intent was to identify the true motive and the intent of the individual's heart. If you do those things for a public display, in other words, your purpose to show your righteousness is go out and stand on the street corner and pray so that other men may see you and say, that's a godly man. That's a righteous man. And to exalt yourself to be some pious individual, then your intent and purpose is wrong. It's not wrong to pray in public. That's not what I'm saying. If somebody comes up to you in the grocery store and say, look, brother, sister, will you pray for me? I need this. And if you felt led to pray for them right there, that's not what he's speaking about. But it's in the fact that you do it specifically with the motivation that you might be known of men that you're a righteous person. So that self-righteousness is what it individually is. And so if you do those things in public with the intent to show you're righteous, you will have no reward from God, because you rather desire the praise of man rather than God. And which is greater, the reward of men or the reward of God? You know, you've got it, you think about it on this end. And you know, when you think about the blessings of God, you don't really think about it like this, but you should really think about it this way. You know, a lot of people don't serve God now because they are living their life to the fullest here because they want what they can get out of life right now. So they're getting a reward now, right? They're not going to have a reward then, but they're getting a reward now. Well, it's no different with us as children of God. If we do those things in order that we might receive the praise of men now, then we're not going to have no reward then. And so that's kind of a hard thing to think about or to say, but, you know, in essence, that is truth. And so now let me find my place. All right, let's move on here just a little bit. Let's talk about it a little bit more. Now, motive and intent of the heart can be greater than the act itself. So think about that. Motive and intent can be greater than the act itself. If you choose to go out and cut that elderly person's grass, what was your reason for doing that? Why did you do that? What was your purpose behind it? What was your motivation? Was your intent and motivation to truly help that individual because you felt led by the Spirit to go do that for them because they was unable to do it? Or was it that you might be seen by the church people say, hey, you know, look, I went down and cut Sister So-and-so's grass because she wasn't able to do that, you know, and you out telling all the people and letting them know that you done it. What was your motivation? Was it to get the praise of God or the praise of man? See, so that's what it said. Why I say this: motive intent of the heart can be greater than the act itself. In other words, that is, the intent has disqualified the deed. The intent has, if you do it to get praise of men, to get praise of the pastor, to get praise of your fellow brothers and sisters, or whoever that it may be, if you do it with that motivation in your heart, then you have disqualified, even though the deed was good. It was a good thing. It was a righteous deed. It was a good act. But you have the intent of your heart has disqualified the deed because your intent and your motivation was all wrong. So if we give to charity with a proper heart, mind, with a righteous mind of giving, then we'll be blessed of God. But if we give to a charity for the sole purpose, think about it. If we give to a charity for the sole purpose of a tax write-off or to be praised of men, then there will be no reward from God. Why do you give your tithes? You give your tithes to be seen of men and the pastor, to have it as a tax write-off. And I'm not saying it's wrong to use it for a tax write-off, and that's not what I'm saying at all. But I'm just saying, is that your only motivation? How many men in this world today, millionaires and billionaires, that give to charity every year by the millions and millions of dollars, but the only reason that they do it, the intent of it is just simply for a tax write-off, and that they might be inducted as some kind of a honorable doctor or something of that nature to be lifted up by men. The intent, see, is not pure. And so therefore the deed is nullified by the intent of the heart. You're not going to receive no blessing by it. You received it through the praise of men. And so, in other words, we say it like this. In other words, our good deeds, our righteous deeds, is an action that is only done in order to benefit ourselves with the delusion that we will be blessed of God. Let me read that like I've got it written again. Our good deeds, our righteous actions, is a righteous action that is only done in order to benefit ourselves with the delusion that we will be blessed of God. So you only done what you did in order to benefit yourself, and you have the delusion that God's going to bless me in the meantime. And it don't work that way. See, God said it don't work that way. So Jesus plainly says, if you are seeking a tax write-off or the praise of men, then you have received your reward and you'll receive nothing from God. So the deed was good, the act was good, but the motive and the intent was wrong. So we go all the way back to where we started in the original of this last half of this lesson in Matthew 5. That the motivations and the intent of the heart, see, the corrupt heart is going to bring forth corrupt action. And so therefore, if we're going to have the right, if our deeds are going to be received, then we're going to have a right, pure intent, righteous heart, see, in order that it might be received of God. And so, let me find my place here. We talked, like I said, we talked in the beginning of the lesson when we began back in January on the Beatitudes at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. And one of the key thoughts to helping us to understand what Jesus is speaking about is in Matthew 5 and 8. Matthew 5 and 8, one of the Beatitudes, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And so it's all about a pure heart. So it is from our mind or our heart where all things we do begins. Everything that we do begins with a thought, right? It begins here with a thought, and then it's manifested on the outside. So the idea that Jesus is trying to convey or is conveying is one who has a changed mind on a spiritual level will see God. One who has a changed mind on a spiritual level will see God. So the idea Jesus is teaching in the Sermon on the Mount is to have a change of mind, an inward change in concert with an outward expression, which we spoke about just a few minutes ago. You want not only want an expression of an outward, but you want a changed heart to go along with it. So you want it all to be lined up. You can't be double-minded, be saying one thing and thinking, or doing one thing and thinking another, or thinking one thing and doing another. Everything's got to line up. You can't take, like we tell ourselves all the time. You hear preachers and teachers talk about the Word of God. You've got to apply the Word of God to your life. You've got to apply it to your heart. And whatever the Word says, be ye doers of the Word. We're to take that and we're to be changed here, and it will manifest itself on the outward. And so what Jesus is dealing with at this particular time is now he's dealing with those who have exactly the opposite. They have an outward expression without an inward change. And so he was dealing with a corrupt mind, brought forth corrupt actions in the last half of the 5th chapter. But now he's dealing with people who have exactly the opposite, an outward expression without an inward exchange or inward change. So therefore, those who give or do acts of righteousness without a pure heart will not see God, or neither be blessed of him. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. So that's what he's speaking about. Now, so let's move on. I hope you understood what I was speaking about, all those things right there, what it means. You got to line up this with what you're doing out here. You can do all the good deeds you want to, but if your heart ain't right, it's kind of like we've said many times. Someone can come into this church and they can sit here and they can be here every service, clapping their hands and praising all they want to and lifting up their hands, showing their righteousness. But if their heart if they haven't been born again, they're still just as unsaved as what they was when they came in. And so that's what you've got to have, a change of heart that matches your outward expression too. Now, Jesus speaks of, in verse number 1 or verse number 2, therefore when thou doest thine alms, do not sound a trumpet before thee, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory of men. Verily I say unto you that they have the reward. So, now when Jesus speaks of not sounding a trumpet when you do your acts of righteousness, what does he mean? Well, to our ears and our Western understanding, we automatically think of a musical instrument, a trumpet, right? We understand what that is. But is that what Jesus is speaking about? Well, perhaps. We're not going to say that it wasn't something that didn't happen. I actually listened to a particular teacher. He said one time he went to a synagogue, and he said that when it come time to give, he said they had a box up on the stage for people to put money in, and he said they would call for people to bring and put money in it. And he said they literally got up, and every time somebody got up and walked up and put money into the box, they would sound a trumpet. So this was something that he witnessed himself literally had happened. Now, we have nothing in the historical records saying that this was actually a practice at that particular time, but it does not disqualify the fact that it wasn't something that did not happen. If Jesus said it, it might have been an very actual thing, very much to what has been said by this particular teacher. But anyway, first of all, like I said, there was no records from this particular time that it was an actual practice. Now, some Bible scholars have indicated that the trumpet or the shofar, if you'll understand what that is, if you go look up the word trumpet in the Bible, it means a shofar, which is basically a ram's horn, refers to the hole in the public alms chest in which the money was dropped, which was allotted for the people or for the poor or service of the poor. And such holes, it said, were wide at the top or wide at the bottom. And in other words, it basically looked like a trumpet. It was big in one end and small in the other. And what would happen was that when people would walk by and throw the money into that trumpet that looked like a trumpet, they throw it in there. Some of them would throw it in with force, and it would, jingle. And it would make a sound, as it was going in, so that they would let other people know, hey, look, I put some money into the alms box, into the poor box. And so that's been one of the suggestions that it has been done. That was what he was speaking about. And so whatever it may have been, it was something that Jesus seen as hypocritical. It don't matter whatever it was. It was something that was designed by the individual to draw attention to themselves for their so-called righteous deed. And while, like I said, it may indeed have been a righteous deed, but yet and still it was nullified because the intent of the heart was wrong, because they wanted self-praise. They wanted to show their self-righteousness. So what is a hypocrite? Now we understand basically exactly what a hypocrite is. We know it's someone who professes one thing and does another. But what is the definition of the hypocrite in the Scripture? What does that mean? Have anybody in here ever looked up the word hypocrite in the Bible and seen what the word hypocrite means and where it comes from? Some of you probably have and you just forgot it. I'm going to give you the benefit of a doubt. So anyway, hypocrite, according to Vines, I believe that was Vines, or maybe it was Strong's, I'm pretty sure, yeah, Vines. Hypocrite means a stage actor. It was custom for the Greek and Roman actors to speak in large mass with mechanical devices for augmenting the force of the voice. Hence, the word became used metaphorical of a dissembler or a hypocrite. So a hypocrite was an actor. That's what they were at that particular time. That was the name it was given to them. And I guess you maybe could think, you could perhaps, they said they wore a mask and they used something to cause their voice to be changed. Maybe you could think about Darth Vader, you know. But that's what it was. So where do actors perform? In public, on stage. Of course, we see them what we see them in television, but at that time they done it on stage and in public. And why did they do it? Why did the actors perform this way? Why did they do it in public? To gain an audience. To have what? The attention of men. Right? So notice where Jesus said they do their alms. In the synagogues and the streets, places of the public, in order that they might get the most desired effect. When we're talking about hypocrites, actors right here. So when you talk about the words hypocrite in the same context right here, let me read that again. Therefore, when thou doest thine alms, do not sound a trumpet before thee, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets. Now, so when we talk about the synagogues right here, that does not necessarily mean the synagogue like what we have taught in the past of gathering together, which was actual buildings like this where they came together for the teaching of the Torah. But remember, the word synagogue means assembly. So basically, a synagogue in this term could mean any place, anywhere where a bunch of people were assembled together. Like people when they get together on a town square to have something, that basically would qualify as a synagogue because it was where they all assembled together. So it means assembly. So in that sense, you could think about it. So this is where Jesus said they do their alms. In synagogues and in the street, places of public, in order to get the most desired effect. So that's what hypocrites do. The actors do. They do what they do to gain an audience, and they do it in the most public place. And so therefore they have their praise, just like many of the actors and hypocrites of today. They desire to be praised. They desire the praise of men. How many times have we had, or we know an actor that we thought a lot about, that we actually admired, and we thought, well, you know, they're actually a great model, a great role model. And we only find out later just how utterly corrupted they are. You know, you had a vision of one thing because they portrayed this certain image, and it looked to you, you know, that image they portrayed, well, you know, that's how I want my child to grow up and be. Or perhaps I want a child to say, I want to grow up and be like that. But then you find out later just how corrupted in their heart they really are. That's a hypocrite. That describes exactly what most actors are today. That they appear to be one thing, but there's something totally different on the inside. Well, you know, I'm sure we could all name many actors who do a lot of things on TV that it looks good, but their own public or their private lives says something else, and what's in their heart says something else. But anyway, you know, think about how did it change your view of that person? How did it change your view of that person when you found out that they were doing one thing and yet still in their heart they were totally corrupt and totally different than what you thought they were? They projected that image of righteousness. I mean, you think about it, it in particular applies to us as Christians because indeed Jesus is speaking to the scribes and the Pharisees. He's speaking to the religious of that day. And so in essence, this is speaking concerning us as well as being hypocrites. You know, how many people have we known that we thought were truly righteous individuals that projected an image of righteousness, showed themselves to be righteous, then you find out behind the scenes they are not doing anything righteous at all. And their intent, how many do you see that's filling the pulpits every day that they're projecting an image of righteousness, but indeed their intent and the motives of their heart is just self-grandeur. It's self-righteousness, self-motivating to do what they want to do, to fulfill their desire and what they want. And so your mind changes toward that individual. And so that's why we have to be careful. That's what Jesus is dealing with. And so we thought that they were a wonderful person, an excellent role model, only to find out they were full of self-serving corruption. They have the reward. And so that's what Jesus is speaking about. Now, moving on just a little bit here, Jesus uses hyperbole when in his direction in doing righteousness. So let's read verse 3. It says, "But when thou doest thine alms, let not thy left hand know what thy right hand is doing." Verse 4, "That thine alms may be in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret himself shall reward thee openly." So, Jesus is using hyperbole in this particular situation. So how can the left hand not know what the right hand is literally doing? You think about it in that exact way. How can the left hand not know what the right hand is literally doing? Because both hands do only what is communicated to them by the mind, right? Your mind controls both your left and your right hand, so you can't tell your right hand to do something that your left hand don't know what's going on. So so it's not in the literal sense what he's speaking about. So there's a couple of things that perhaps we can interject here that will help us to understand or might apply to what Jesus is saying. First, the left hand is close to the right hand, therefore saying that when we do our acts of righteousness, our charity, our alms, let it be done secretly without even letting those closest to us know it. Even our closest family member, our closest friend. Perhaps even our husband or our wife, keep it in secret and be a reward of God. So this here in particular lends to what Jesus has already said concerning not doing your acts of righteousness to gain the praise of men. So true acts of righteousness neither need the praise of men or the closest friends or family. And so don't let that which is closest to you even know it. Just keep it to yourself. Do it as God has ordered you to do it. Do it with a pure heart, with a righteous heart, with a pure intent, and then you will be rewarded of the Lord. And so perhaps that's one thing that we can look at it. But there's also something else. Second, and we've taught about this in times past, and I've actually preached on it years ago, what the right hand means. And as we have often said, we have to take the context of the culture, of the time and the place into consideration. Now, among the Jews, the right hand was seen as a symbol of power and authority. We talked about some of those things just a few weeks back. So the right hand was seen as a symbol of power and authority. The right hand was dominant, and it symbolized power. So the right hand is seen as the higher spiritual authority. So think about it in that matter. So in essence, the right hand has the power and authority, so let not the left hand know what the right hand is doing. So when you look at it that way, the right hand does not need to or is neither obligated to let the left hand know what it is doing. Kind of like a boss. I ain't got to tell you all my decisions. I just make the decisions and go on that decision that I make. Why? Because I have the authority to do that. And so you think about it like this. The idea is that you have the right or the authority to do what you will and giving without asking or telling anyone else. You don't have to ask anybody else about your giving, and you have that authority. You can either tell someone or you don't have to tell someone, right? That power, in other words, lies within yourself. If I choose to give or do an act of charity or alms or what righteousness, I can choose to tell Brother Jimmy, or I can choose to keep it to myself. So let not the left hand know what the right hand is doing. I have the authority within myself. And so perhaps that's what he's speaking about when he speaks about those things. And so why is this important? Why is this important? Because this is the right way to give in order to be blessed of God. It's the right way to give in order to be rewarded by our Heavenly Father that is in heaven. When we do something in order to be noticed, our motive and intent are revealed not only to God but unto men. So when we give in secret, then our motive and intent are only known to God. So think about that. When we give in secret, then our motive and intent is only known to God. But when we do it openly, we're saying to men, look, see what I'm doing. And so therefore we received our reward because we have been given the praise of men. Now we could move on here, but I wanted to take a little more time on this before we finish this up. And so we'll pick back up here next week, and hopefully you got something out of the lesson this morning. There's a lot more to come. You're dismissed in Jesus' name.